Hello dear students, welcome to this lecture. Today we will learn about Jeremy Bentham and his utilitarian philosophy. Some of the important objectives of this lecture is to understand Bentham's utilitarian theory as ethical theory. Second, to know about his theory of philosophic calculus and to question the rights and obligations exercising power, and finally we will conclude it. By the end of this lecture, you will have a comprehensive understanding to utilitarian philosophy and its utility in making a democratic society. To begin with, let me brief you about Jeremy Bentham and his life and contribution as a political philosopher. Bentham was one of the foundational philosophers of modern utilitarian tradition. And inspired by Enlightenment values, Bentham wanted to build a science of politics which would be objective, empirical and moral. His ideas greatly inspired James Mill and John Stuart Mill. Utilitarians like Bentham argue that the social utility characterized by his famous formulation, greatest happiness of greatest number, should be the guiding principle of society, politics and ethics. Bentham, along with other utilitarian thinkers, has greatly influenced the development of modern social and political institutions. Jeremy Bentham advocated the reform of social, legal and political institutions in line with the principle of greatest happiness of the greatest number. He was a supporter of greater democratization and as the founder of group philosophical radicals. He cultivated intellectual experimentation and innovation. Bentham was born in 1748 in England. He was born into a wealthy family and had an Oxford education. Jeremy Bentham's interest in philosophy began with law and legal reforms. One has to keep in mind that Bentham lived during a period of huge social, economic and intellectual upheaval in Europe. The Industrial Revolution was fast changing socio-economic structures in Europe. Alongside scientific revolution led to amazing discoveries in physical sciences, which included the works of luminaries like Isaac Newton, among several others. In this context, many political philosophers wanted to bring the scientific approach to the understanding of society and politics. This was the period of Enlightenment, sometimes referred as the Age of Reason. Bentham was a quintessential Enlightenment thinker who wanted to find the most rational way of organizing society. His most important works include a fragment on government, which was published in 1776, Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, published in 1789, and the Constitutional Code, which was published in 1830. His work had the particular aim of bringing about reforms in Britain, but their theoretical underpinnings have wider application. He met James Mill in 1809 and they became intellectual associates for the rest of their lives. They set up the journal Westminster Review in 1824, which advocated the philosophy of utilitarianism. Bentham died in 1832. He was intellectually and politically active till the end of his life. His legacy is such that he is considered by many as an integral part of Western political philosophy canon. Bentham and his utilitarian philosophy. Bentham believed that human motivations can be reduced to the relative simple logic of maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. He saw pleasure and pain as the two sovereign masters of all humans. Thus, he wrote, and I quote, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do as well as to determine what we shall do, unquote. Therefore, for Jeremy Bentham, pain and pleasure offer objective means to understand and predict human behavior and thereby society. His definition of the principle of utility is based on his understanding of pain and pleasure. Utility is defined in terms of maximization of pleasure and or minimization of pain. Hence, the utility of an action or policy can be measured by evaluation of how much it increases pleasure and or minimizes pain. An action which does not increase pleasure and or increase pain has little or negative utility. Bentham says following about utility, and I quote, "Something is in the interest of a person when it tends to add to the sum total of his pleasures or diminish the sum total of his pains." Bentham even goes on to identify several kinds of pleasures which humans want to maximize and several types of pain which humans want to minimize. Still, notion that humans act out of self-interest was not a new insight, as even Hobbes mentioned the same centuries earlier. However, what makes Bentham's utilitarian philosophy different was his equation of morality with utility maximization. Jeremy Bentham not only argued that human beings try to maximize utility, but also argued that maximizing utility was ethically justified. His utilitarian theory was not just descriptive, but also normative in its nature. Jeremy Bentham was thus an ethical hedonist. How does Bentham tie utilitarianism with ethical behavior? The answer lies in the following words, and I quote, "It is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong," unquote. For Bentham, an individual needs to calculate the utility of an action by examining its cost benefit for all those who will be affected by it. For example, an individual has in front of him two different alternate policies which will affect a total of 10 people. If the first policy increases net pleasure of 4 people and the second one increases the net pleasure of 7 people, for Jeremy Bentham, the ethically right thing to do is to pursue the second policy, as it increases the greatest happiness of greatest number. Bentham argues that in such an ethical utility calculation, one has to be impartial to one's own net pleasure and that of others as only the overall net calculation that should matter. Thus, Bentham's utilitarianism is concerned about the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people affected by a particular act or policy. This is why it is sometimes referred to as active utilitarianism, as it is an act that is being evaluated for utility. The context of the act will therefore determine the nature of utility calculation. If it is an act being considered by a state, then it will affect all citizens, and therefore the greatest happiness of greatest number of citizens need to be calculated. If it is an act being considered by an individual, he or she need to calculate the greatest happiness of the greatest number of all those who will be affected by it. This is what makes Bentham's utilitarianism as an ethical theory, which is democratic in its orientation as it seeks to maximize the net pleasure of majority. Bentham's calculation of utility is highly quantitative in nature. He considered individuals as real entities and the community as a conceptual fictitious entity which is a collection of real entities of individuals. Therefore, the calculation of net utility of a community for him was nothing but the sum of net utility of individuals. Moreover, in order to aid a comprehensive calculation of net utility, Jeremy Bentham gave the falsific calculus, which gives 7 criteria to evaluate the utility of an act or policy. First is duration, which is a reference to the duration of pleasure or pain of an act. For example, a movie might give you a few hours pleasure, whereas getting an educational degree might give you a lifelong pleasure. Second is the intensity, which is reference to the intensity of pleasure or pain caused by an act or policy. For instance, listening to a song might give you a less intense pleasure than getting married. Third is the propinquity, which is a reference to how near or remote the pleasure or pain caused by an act is. For instance, a policy might benefit after only 4 years, which means pleasure is that remote or far. Fourth is extent, which is a reference to the width of pleasure or pain caused by an act. For example, an educational degree will give you a pleasure over a wide variety of domains, be it respect to employment or social status. Fifth is certainty, which is a reference to the certainty of pleasure or pain promised by an act. For instance, if the predicted utility of a policy need not be certain, as it could fail in some circumstances. Sixth is the purity, which is a reference to how pure the pleasure or pain caused by an act is. For example, eating excessive sweets might give you a pleasure, but it is not pure pleasure because it might give you the pain of diabetes later. The last criteria given by Bentham is fecundity, which is a reference to whether the pleasure caused by an act leads to more pleasure. For example, an educational degree can lead to more pleasure like employment. Bentham strongly believes that using his falsific calculus, one can measure the net utility of an act in an objective manner. Bentham saw his utilitarian philosophy as offering hope and optimistic to society. So he wrote, and I quote, "Create all the happiness you are able to create, remove all the misery you are able to remove. Every day will allow you, will invite you to add something to the pleasure of others or to diminish something of their pains." Unquote. Having understood the utilitarian philosophy of Bentham, it is now important to analyze how it informs his political philosophy. One of the key questions of political philosophy during Bentham's time, which is relevant even today, is the question of rights and obligations. What kind of rights and obligations should be enshrined in a legitimate political community? What should be the basis of these rights and obligations? Different philosophers have given different kinds of justifications. John Locke, for instance, gave a theory of natural rights to justify rights of life, liberty, and property. Immanuel Kant put forward the notion of rational categorical imperative as the basis of rights. In such a context, Jeremy Bentham came up with the notion of utilitarian theory of rights. Bentham argued that the existence of government relies on coercion, and coercion is never pleasant. So he wrote, and I quote, "Government cannot be exercised without coercion, and nor coercion without producing unhappiness." Unquote. Government has to necessarily use coercion to establish a system of rights in a society. The sole justification of such coercion is if it results in a net increase in happiness for greatest majority within a society. Thus, the only justifiable rights are those which increase the net happiness of greatest majority. Jeremy Bentham writes, and I quote, "My rights may or may not be a source of pleasure to me, but the corresponding obligations they impose on others are certain source of pain to them. The government therefore should never create rights instruments of felicity, though they are, unless it can be absolutely certain that their probable advantages would more than compensate for their certain disadvantages." Unquote. Unlike the inflexible natural rights paradigm of Locke or the categorical imperatives of Kant, Bentham's utility framework offers more flexibility and is more democratic as it concerns the happiness of majority. Bentham identifies subsistence, abundance, security, and equality as domains of pleasure that need to be maximized by state. He defined subsistence as the necessities of life like food, clothing, and shelter, which will prevent physical suffering and unhappiness. The state should seek to ensure subsistence of all citizens, preferably by fostering employment opportunities for them to maintain themselves or by aiding the poor by taking contributions from the rich. Further, the state should also pursue abundance such that the happiness of citizens are maximized because of luxuries and other comforts. Abundance for Bentham is essentially the presence of surplus resources in the hands of people which would enable them to satisfy their desires beyond subsistence. Security for Bentham meant the security of a person, his or her life, power, status, reputation, and property. Finally, state should also seek to promote equality in moral, intellectual, economic, and political realms. Moral and intellectual equality can be promoted by providing education to citizens, especially one that advocates utilitarian ethics. Economic equality needs to be maximized by the state because, due to the principle of diminishing marginal utility, concentration of wealth in the hands of few will reduce the overall net utility of a society. However, this needs to be balanced with other utility concerns like security of property, etc. Political equality can be promoted by increased democratization. The government pursues these goals by offering to complying citizens incentives like status, privileges, etc. as pleasure maximizing motivations. At the same time, the state uses punishments as pain increasing tools against those who might seek to defy the state. If employed in a balanced manner, Bentham believes that utility calculus of individual citizens will lead them to obey the state regulations which anyway are focused on the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Bentham believed that a democracy with regular elections and free press as the best form of government. Again, here as well, utilitarian logic guides Bentham. In a democracy, rulers have to be elected by the majority of the people. Hence, rulers will see utility in maximizing the utility of majority, who will also elect only those set of rulers who increases their net utility. This makes democracy more accountable, especially with the establishment of free press and other related liberties. Bentham also made a key contribution to understanding of how power is exercised in modern times by giving the idea of panopticon. It is the name given by Bentham to the model prison he designed for the British, which never came to fruition. However, in the 20th century, Foucault interpreted the panoptical as a signaling the emergence of a new technology of power, which Foucault would call disciplinary power. Foucault would describe the design of panopticon in the following manner, and I quote, "A perimeter building in the form of a ring. At the center of this, a tower pierced by large windows opening onto the inner face of the ring. The outer building is divided into cells, each of which traverses the whole thickness of the building. These cells have two windows, one opening onto the inside facing the window of the central tower, the other outer one allowing daylight to pass through the whole cell. All that is then needed is to put an overseer in the tower and place in each of these cells a lunatic, a patient, a convict, a worker or schoolboy." Unquote. Bentham had designed a cost-effective prison where the power was invisible, as prisoners feared the central tower, which was a tool of surveillance. Foucault argued that this was a new kind of power which relied on surveillance, invisibility and omnipresence, unlike the earlier forms of power which were visible and violent. The earlier forms of power were easier to resist as they were visible, but modern forms of power ensure conformity by being invisible and therefore are harder to resist. This is especially relevant in the 21st century when we had to understand the emergence of surveillance capitalism like social media sites apart from surveillance state. In conclusion, Bentham has left a rich legacy which has influenced subsequent thinkers of several traditions. Bentham believed that human motivations can be reduced to the relative simple logic of maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. He saw pleasure and pain as the two sovereign masters of all humans. Bentham was a quintessential Enlightenment thinker. His utilitarian theory was not just descriptive but also normative in its nature. Jeremy Bentham not only argued that human beings tried to maximize utility but also argued that maximizing utility was ethically justified. However, there are several criticisms of Bentham's utilitarianism from a variety of perspectives. For instance, minority rights and individual rights seem unprotected in Bentham's society, as the greatest happiness of the greatest number is the guiding principle. Therefore, Benthamite state can be majoritarian in its orientation. Further, some philosophers have questioned the principle of utility itself and have argued that humans do not always seek maximization of pleasure. These criticisms of Bentham's utilitarianism need to be examined with care and given their due. However, it is indisputable that Bentham's ideas have greatly shaped and influenced modern Western political philosophy. Dear students, it was all about today's lecture. Hope you have enjoyed this session. Thank you.